Pryor, you listen to me. I don't care what you do once this thing's over with. You can lay down and die and rot in the street.
For millions of viewers who grew up watching Bonanza, one character stood taller than the rest, quite literally. Eric Haas Cartwright, the good-natured giant played by Dan Blocker, wasn't the sharpest of the Cartwright brothers, but he was the one people loved the most. He was warm. He was funny. He was fiercely loyal. And for 13 seasons, he made America believe that the biggest man in the room could also be the gentlest. But off-screen, Dan Blocker's life was far more complicated, far more dramatic, and far more admirable than the character he played. And now, decades after his death, his son Dirk Blocker, himself a working actor for over 50 years, has opened up about the man behind Haas in a way that confirms what longtime fans had always sensed. Dan Blocker wasn't just playing a good man on television. He was one in real life. And that authenticity came at a cost his family carried long after the cameras stopped rolling. Bobby Dan Davis Blocker arrived in the world in dramatic fashion, born on December 10, 1928, in the small town of DeKalb, Texas. He reportedly weighed a staggering 14 pounds at birth, an early sign of the physical scale that would define much of his life. His parents, Ora and Mary Blocker, ran a modest grocery store in the West Texas town of O'Donnell, and it was there that young Dan learned the values that would follow him for the rest of his life. Hard work, humility, and treating people fairly, no matter their size or status. By the time he reached his teenage years, Dan was already an imposing figure, well over 6 feet tall and built like the athlete he would become. He attended Texas Military Institute before enrolling at Hardin-Simmons University, where he played football and studied English. He later transferred to Sul Ross State Teachers College in Alpine, Texas, continuing his football career while shifting his academic focus toward speech and drama. It was there, almost by accident, that Blocker's path toward acting began to take shape, not through some burning childhood ambition, but through a college drama department that needed strong hands to move sets and props. That small, practical job planted a seed that would eventually grow into a television legacy. He graduated in 1950 with a degree in speech and drama, but before Hollywood ever entered the picture, history intervened. In the early 1950s, Dan Blocker was drafted into the United States Army and sent to fight in the Korean War. He trained at Fort Polk, Louisiana, before being deployed to the front lines as an infantry sergeant with the 179th Infantry Regiment, part of the storied 45th Infantry Division. For roughly 7 months, from the winter of 1951 into the summer of 1952, Blocker served in brutal combat conditions near the front, enduring the kind of relentless fighting that defined some of the war's fiercest engagements. During one of these battles, Blocker was wounded while helping fellow soldiers under fire. For his actions and his injuries, he was awarded the Purple Heart, along with several other honors, including the Combat Infantryman Badge, the Korean Service Medal, and the Republic of Korea Presidential Unit Citation. He was eventually evacuated and sent home to recover, his body bearing the physical scars of war, and his outlook on the world permanently altered. Those who knew him later in life often pointed to this period as the root of his lifelong disdain for violence and unnecessary conflict. Blocker became known in interviews for speaking candidly against militarism, at one point criticizing the use of American resources to wage war overseas. He had seen firsthand what combat did to young men, and it left him with little patience for glorifying it. When Blocker returned to civilian life, acting still wasn't the plan. He pursued graduate studies, eventually earning a master's degree in dramatic arts, and even spent time working as a teacher, first teaching English and drama in Sonora, Texas, then later as an elementary school teacher and coach in New Mexico. He also picked up work as a rodeo performer and a bar bouncer, jobs that suited his physical stature and his working class roots. It was a move to California to pursue further studies at UCLA that quietly redirected his future. His imposing frame, easy charisma, and natural warmth caught the attention of casting agents at a moment when television westerns were exploding in popularity. Networks needed actors who could believably play cowboys, ranchers, and rugged frontiersmen, and Blocker fit the bill perfectly. He began picking up small parts in some of the biggest western shows of the era, guest appearances on Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, Have Gun Will Travel, and Colt .45. He built a reputation as a reliable, likable presence, someone who brought a little extra humanity to every role, however small. In 1957, he landed a more substantial part in The Restless Gun, a role that helped establish him as a rising television talent. Then, in 1959, everything changed. Blocker was cast as Eric Haas Cartwright in a new NBC Western called Bonanza. Bonanza would go on to become one of the most successful television programs in American history, running for 14 seasons and airing more than 400 episodes. Blocker starred alongside Lorne Greene, who played family patriarch Ben Cartwright, and Michael Landon, who played youngest son Little Joe. Together, the cast became a kind of surrogate family, both on screen and off. Haas Cartwright was written as the tender-hearted middle son, not the most educated or the most polished of the Cartwright brothers, but the one with the biggest heart. Audiences, particularly children, gravitated toward him instantly. He was the brother who would rather talk his way out of a fight than throw a punch, the one who treated every person he met, rich or poor, respected or overlooked, with the same basic decency. What made the performance resonate so deeply was the fact that it wasn't much of a performance at all. Friends and colleagues often remarked that Blocker's off-screen personality mirrored Haas almost exactly. He was, by nearly every account, an approachable, down-to-earth man despite his growing fame. The kind of guy, as one co-star later put it, you could sit down and have a beer with. Ironically, while Haas was portrayed as simple-minded, Blocker himself held a graduate degree and was known among the cast as one of the most well-read, thoughtful people on set. He often said he shaped his portrayal of Haas around a quote from the 18th century Quaker missionary Stephen Grellet, about doing whatever good one can while there is still time to do it. That philosophy, more than any acting technique, was what gave Haas his enduring warmth. Blocker's success on Bonanza also opened doors in film. He appeared alongside Frank Sinatra in two features, Come Blow Your Horn and Lady in Cement, and built close friendships with his castmates that extended far beyond the studio lot. He even stood as best man at Michael Landon's wedding. Despite his gentle screen persona, Blocker was not a man who avoided confrontation when it mattered. During a filming trip through the American South at a time when segregation still dictated who could stay where and eat where, Blocker and the rest of the Bonanza cast encountered a hotel that refused to accommodate their black colleagues. Rather than accept the arrangement, Blocker made it clear that if the hotel wouldn't house the entire cast and crew together, none of them would stay. It was a small moment in the grand sweep of the civil rights era, but it revealed something essential about who Blocker was beneath the folksy exterior. In a 1964 interview, he summed up his worldview bluntly, saying he hated bullies more than almost anything, and that despite being a big man who preferred to avoid fights, he wouldn't hesitate to step in if he saw someone larger taking advantage of someone smaller. For Blocker, his size wasn't something to be feared. It was a responsibility. As Bonanza soared in popularity, Blocker found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the loss of privacy that came with it. His towering height and unmistakable face made him instantly recognizable everywhere he went, and simple family outings frequently turned into impromptu public appearances. A trip to a baseball game with his young sons was cut short after fans in the stands wouldn't leave him alone. Even an attempted vacation getaway to Mexico turned into a spectacle, with locals calling out to him using his character's name. By the early 1970s, seeking something closer to a normal life, Blocker moved his family to Switzerland. The language barrier meant fewer people recognized him on the street, and the quiet countryside offered a sense of peace that had become increasingly hard to find in the United States. Rumors swirled that financial trouble had driven the move, but Blocker dismissed the idea outright, noting that Bonanza had made him financially comfortable. He was simply chasing something money couldn't buy: anonymity. He was known to reflect candidly on his own success, at one point remarking with a mix of humor and self-awareness that he had, in his words, sold out for the money, even as he continued to express admiration for underpaid teachers and others doing harder work for far less recognition. In the early months of 1972, Blocker underwent what was expected to be a routine surgery to remove his gallbladder. The procedure initially appeared successful, and his family believed the worst was behind them. But in a cruel and unexpected turn, Blocker developed a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that traveled to his lungs, and died on May 13, 1972, at just 43 years old. The news devastated fans across the country and stunned the Bonanza cast and crew, many of whom considered Blocker not just a colleague, but a close friend. The show's writers, led by Michael Landon, made the unusual decision to acknowledge Haas's death within the storyline itself, rather than quietly writing the character out. Landon chose restraint over melodrama, allowing the Cartwright family's grief to play out in silence and unspoken emotion rather than through explicit explanation. It was, by most accounts, one of the more quietly powerful moments in the show's run, and one that mirrored the very real grief the cast was processing off-camera. Bonanza continued for one more season without its beloved middle son, but the show was never quite the same. Ratings declined, scheduling changes hurt its momentum, and in 1973, after 14 seasons, NBC brought the Cartwright family saga to a close. Dan Blocker's son Dirk Blocker was only 14 when his father died, a loss that would shape the rest of his life in ways both visible and quiet. Dirk went on to become an actor himself, appearing in projects ranging from war dramas to the long-running comedy series Brooklyn Nine-Nine. But unlike his father, Dirk has spoken about deliberately steering away from the kind of overwhelming fame that once made it impossible for Dan Blocker to enjoy a simple family outing without being swarmed by fans. In reflecting on his father decades later, Dirk has described coming to understand Dan Blocker not just as a beloved television star, but as a genuinely complex man, a decorated war veteran who hated violence, a wealthy celebrity uneasy with his own success, and a quietly committed advocate for fairness who backed up his convictions with action rather than just words. What Dirk's reflections confirm is something longtime fans of Bonanza had suspected for over half a century. The kindness of Haas Cartwright wasn't a character trait invented by a writer's room. It was simply Dan Blocker, brought to life on screen exactly as he lived. More than 50 years after his death, that authenticity remains the reason audiences still return to Bonanza. Not for the gunfights or the ranch drama, but for the unmistakable warmth of a gentle giant who, it turns out, was never really acting at all.